Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going to be going through a tier list of the core units for each of the factions in Star Wars Legion. So here we are, nearing the end of the tier list series, just this one and then the support heroes tier list left. To go through the tier list again, essentially D tier is units that, even in their best situation, are still pretty weak and most of the time will offer very little to your army and actually kind of take away from your list by having to spend the points on them. C tier is sort of obviously the next tier up, and units that in their best situation aren't bad, but most of the time are not going to be super impactful and probably not worth their points. B tier is the same thing. These are kind of average units, so they're never going to be terrible, but in their best situation, they probably won't be like amazingly good. They're just very average, or they might offer sort of decent value for points. A tier is where we're starting to look at sort of the good units. So these will be units that are either consistently quite good or in certain situations will be extremely strong. And finally, S tier, which is going to be units that are nearly always good, offer good value for points, and are going to be sort of beneficial to your army in almost all game states. So yeah, starting off at the bottom of the tier list and in D tier, it's going to be the Ewok Skirmishers. Now, Ewok Skirmishers are an interesting case of that. Even though they are in Brightree Village, unfortunately what they suffer from is they don't have a ranged option, and they also are not that effective in melee, which is sort of the only thing they can actually do. In order to get them to be somewhat usable in melee, you have to take the heavy weapon with the Axe Ewok, and then also an upgrade that lets them gain charge, even though they have to gain a suppressant when they gain charge. And in that situation, you're probably spending around 60 or 70 points on a unit that hits for like 4 PS1 and then doesn't really do a lot afterwards. And unfortunately for the Ewok Skirmishers, that's just not good enough. And for 40 points, you can do a lot better. The lack of any ranged option is just completely crippling. And in a game that does require most units, unless they're sort of highly tuned and focused force units, to do some kind of ranged attack, they are going to really struggle. They do at least offer low profile, which is okay, and the Unhindered is nice as an option. It means you can obviously move through terrain quite effectively. But yeah, the fact these are mercenaries, so you're almost never, the only faction they're available for is rebels, and you're almost never taking them in a regular rebel list. So they only appear in Brightree Village, which is a fairly good list, but is not the reason, and Ewok Skirmishers are not the reason that Brightree Village is good. You can do fun stuff with Insatiable Curiosity and Call to Arms, which is what gives them charge. So then you can like delete an enemy heavy weapon, which is an interesting combo. But yeah, unfortunately, just for their lack of ranged attack and the fact they are, in my opinion, quite overcosted, they're just never going to be sort of a strong unit for me. So that's why they are down in D tier. Moving up to the bottom of C tier, we're going to have the Shore Troopers. Essentially, the Shore Troopers are fine. Their only real issue is that they're quite overcosted. They come in with the heavy, which you're nearly always going to take, at 74 points, which is just expensive. And they're really going to struggle to kind of make up that level of points. What they'll tend to try and do is sit at range 4 using their prepared position, sort of start off a bit further up the board. And then ideally, you just kind of want to be aiming and shooting every turn, because you really don't want to be pushing further up with this unit than you have to, because you just want to take advantage of your range 4 to kind of put fire down on a point. So if you imagine a game of Recover the Research, for instance, these ones would be sitting in your back right corner, just sitting there, shooting range 4 onto either the objective next to them or maybe the one across if they can make it. They do have a decent combo with the Mortar, which we're going to talk about in a second. But yeah, they're a bit overcosted, they're slow, and they're just not what Empire needs in that slot at the moment. Like, Empire doesn't need more long range options. It needs kind of more proactive units, which is what some of their other core can bring. So they're not horrendous, they're just a bit overcosted and don't quite suit the current version of the game. If objectives do shift around a bit, I could see a niche for Shore Troopers. Like, if you do want more units to kind of sit further back and just rain fire down onto a point, then maybe that's an option. But yeah, they're just too expensive for what they offer an army. My suggested fixes here are they could get something like Reliable 1 or even Low Profile, just something to kind of buff them up a little bit. I mean, you could also do a little bit of a points drop if you wanted to, but I feel like Reliable 1 might just go a little bit further. The DF90 mortar, so paired these with the Shore Troopers, because in my head they kind of come as a unit. You can't take the mortar without the Shores. You could take the Shores without the mortar, but I think generally if you're bringing Shore Troopers, you'll probably bring the mortar along as well. And in my opinion, the mortar is slightly better than the Shore Troopers. Can offer almost exactly the same thing, that kind of effective range 4 profile. It also has Sentinel, which is quite nice. If you are taking Shores, you're going to try and get an order on them to coordinate onto these guys, and that could work fairly well as like a combo to maybe anchor one side of the board. But again, that's a combo that's setting you back sort of 120 points, which just feels like quite a lot. And even then, they're not throwing that much damage. Like, it's a combined, they would be throwing, I think, like 8 black, 2 white. So you're probably hitting for like 6 or 7 a turn, which isn't terrible. But after cover and dodges and stuff, that's probably only like 3 or 4 wounds into most units. So yeah, it's not the craziest thing. I mean, this does at least offer suppressive, which is nice. The critical one is okay, but on a dice pool of 2, not sure how often that's going to come in. Its dice pool was updated. I think it used to be 3 white, but then with the suppressive changes, it got upgraded to be 2 black. Yeah, as I've said here, like, they do really like an order for that Sentinel, and again, if you can get that from the Shores, that's even better. They are the cheapest way to field Empire Core, so that's a slight advantage, but again, you have to take Shores to make that happen, so it does mean that maybe they're not actually the cheapest way to field it, but that's at least the hypothetical. 3 red health is also quite sketchy. That's one big hit from like a dedicated unit that's actually meant to be attacking, or, you know, 1 melee attack basically from most melee specialist units, and it'll die. But yeah, I don't know. I'd feel like 4 red health would be too much for this, I think. So, but 3 red health just feels a bit rough. Again, like something like a low profile, or even a reliable one might be quite nice, just to give it a bit more defensive tech. But yeah, again, just not quite what Empire needs right now. I feel like it and Shores really do operate as a pair, and if Shores become good and there becomes a niche for these units that want to sit further back and just hold a more defensive area and shoot onto an objective, then maybe these could see a bit more play. The next unit in C tier is going to be the Black Sun Enforcers. These are available for Shadow Collective. They're also available for Separatists and for Empire. And Black Suns are exactly the same as they've always been. They are a range 2 kind of specialist unit. With their precise 1 and independent aim 1, they can throw out some pretty decent damage if they are able to get into that range 2. Their big weakness is the fact that they don't have any sort of kind of action economy keywords beyond that independent aim 1, which isn't bad. The problem is they don't have, I mean, they shouldn't have steady. I'm not arguing for them to have steady, but they don't have like a charge, for instance. And fully upgraded, whether you take the Magdet or the shotgun, depends a little bit, but they're normally pushing 90 points plus if you take the Vigo as well, which gives them reliable 1, which is a lot to pay. And they don't hit as hard as fleets, and fleets have charge, and thanks to Cassian, fleets now have more survivability. And I think basically in the previous version of the game, Black Suns had, I think, a really effective niche as a hard-hitting close-range unit. But now, not necessarily as much in the course slot, although there are definitely units in the course slot that can do it, but generally in the game there are just more units that are effective at range 2, and unfortunately Black Suns just haven't quite kept pace. Their big weaknesses are they don't naturally surge to hit, and they don't naturally surge to defend, and they don't have any kind of defensive keywords, which when you compare them to like Sleeper Cell or Arcs or even Fleets or even Riots, for instance, like those units are all cheaper and more effective versions of Black Suns. And I think Black Suns do still have something to offer. They're not terrible, but in order to get them to the point where they are effective, you do have to really commit to them. And it's just, they're not as intimidating as they used to be anymore. Damage is a lot easier to come by in the current version of the game compared to the previous version. Personally, I'm a Vigo believer. I think like a defensive surge is huge, or even an attacking surge if you've not been attacked. They're absolutely great. Frag grenades were pretty common take as well, especially if you're taking the Magdet, and that's when they can actually offer something with the blast, the surge to crit, and a pretty reasonable dice pool. They can throw out some decent damage. So yeah, they're not terrible. They just have massively faded from kind of the powerhouse that they used to be in the previous version of the game. And I think now they're just not. I think their only real niche might be a little bit in Empire, but I again, like, I would probably take Riots over these. I don't know, even if they weren't mercenaries is a really interesting question. I think it's good to ask that for these and for Pikes. Like, if they weren't mercenaries, would people take them in the other factions? And I think unfortunately Pikes would be more likely to be taken than these, because I think unfortunately these just don't quite do the job they need to anymore. Moving up to the next unit in C tier, it's going to be the Clone Marksman. These are significantly better than I expected them to be. I thought they would be almost unusable because of their lack of reliable one. But yeah, they're 50 points, which is their sort of main advantage. They're 6 points cheaper than the regular infantry. So if you are purely viewing your infantry, your core options in GAR as attacks, then the marksmen probably do have something to offer. Also, in combination with the mortar, if they just sit back and aim and shoot, a bit like with Shore Troopers, they can offer some decent firepower. Again, they're throwing out sort of 6 black with critical 1 onto a point with suppressive. Like, it's absolutely fine. And yeah, the prepared positions for the dodge token sharing early game also isn't bad. Having marksman is okay, but then you're just not going to have the aims to hand to use marksman. I think the only combo could be if you prepared positions on and then you had an arc unit nearby, and so then you could aim, shoot, and then take an aim from the arcs as well, which is possible. Like, that's a feasible thing, but that's really only going to happen maybe once or twice a game, so actually I don't think marksman is super useful on them. The other main problem is the speed 1. It just makes you very predictable. It really reduces your kind of threat range for objectives and for attacking. So they are going to sit back. They are going to be more passive. And unfortunately, just not, again, similar to the other units we've talked about with Shores and with the Mortar, like, they just don't quite suit the current version of the game. I think they're a valid take, and they're not that much worse than the regular infantry, but losing reliable 1, you absolutely love a surge in GAR, and I think marksman not having access to that is a really big deal. So I think sprinkling like 1 or 2 of these into an army is no bad thing at all, especially if it saves you a few points, but unfortunately I personally just rate the reliable 1 from the regular infantry much higher. So yeah, they're not a terrible unit, as I've said with the other ones here, just not quite as strong as the other option in that slot. Stormtroopers, the sort of, I think the baseline, the kind of most unremarkable core unit in the game. And they just, again, have been, I think, left behind a little bit. Basically, Rebel Troopers are the ones I can kind of most directly compare these to, in that sort of they came out at the same time, and then just they both been updated in different ways throughout the game. Rebel Troopers have gained a huge advantage over Storms by virtue of having a keyword that procs off movement. And that, for me, is the only difference. I think if Storms had Tactical 1, I think they would then jump up hugely, like, in the way I'm viewing these. But unfortunately with Stormtroopers, in order to get value from their keyword, you have to take an entire action, so half of your turn, to aim. Which is okay. Like, and, you obviously can share aims from, Veers or Krennic or something, so it's not unfeasible for them to move and shoot, but if they had tactical, you would then be getting, your action economy would be so much better, and you could always take targeting scopes on top of them for that upgrade. So yeah, they're not a takeable unit, and the problem is for them is most of the heavies they're going to want to be taking, the RT-97C or the DLT, are both range 4 options. So you have those range 4 options, and then your gun is base range 3, which just causes a little bit of a disconnect in terms of, like, you can be doing split firing and things like that, but do you really want to take that weapon upgrade if all you're going to be doing is maybe like 1 hit through armor, or 2 hits into an infantry? It's just not, they don't offer enough in the game, unfortunately. And when you compare these to Snow Troopers and Riots, for instance, who both have abilities that proc off movement and are a very similar cost, it just leaves Storms looking a little bit underwhelming. So I think they could use a little bit of a change, a points drop maybe or something, but the problem is you don't want to drop them too much, because then they can just be taken to allow you to increase your activation count. And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about when it comes to core, is because you have to take them. If they become too efficient, then they just kind of just become 3 acts in your army that just do nothing. And I think in Rebels especially, and in droids, that is especially common, where you can just kind of take the core to fill out your requirements to buff your activation count and then just don't do anything with them. Whereas I feel like Empire Core are meant to just be a bit more proactive, and unfortunately Storms just don't offer that much. Saying that they're not terrible, red saves, they're 42 points, they're not the worst. If you do just want to take a unit to sit at the back, that's okay. But personally, I would always be taking either Snows or Riots over these guys. Moving up into B tier, and we're going to be talking about the Rebel Veterans. Essentially, for me, these are just a better version of Shore Troopers. They're a little bit cheaper, and their heavy weapon also combines to make them sort of significantly cheaper. They come in sort of 70 points rather than 76 points, which is a pretty big deal. They also have the low profile, which is really nice. Obviously, they have the white saves rather than the red saves, but then they do naturally surge to hit, which means their firepower is a little bit better. The lack of courage 2 is a little bit rough, but then Shore Troopers are also courage 1, so it's not really that different. Yeah, I think they are just a little bit overcosted for me, and they do struggle with a lack of just, again, being proactive. It's these core units that don't have things that proc off movement that essentially I feel like maybe I'm punishing a little bit too much, but I just don't really rate Rebel Veterans. I never really have, and them being 8 points more than Fleets and Rebel Troopers I think is just too much for a price to pay. And when you can get a Rebel Trooper unit for 40 points that can actually offer some objective play, I think that feels a lot better. Rebel Veterans can offer more in the firepower department, like their heavy weapon is very efficient and it can probably shoot most turns of the game. But yeah, I just don't really rate them myself. The other problem is that in order to get value from their coordinate keyword, they need to be getting an order, and Rebels, I would argue, struggle even more than Empire to have time to give their core units orders. So yeah, it just doesn't quite fit together for me. You can maybe do some stuff on turn 1. I've seen some people do like HQ uplink with them, for instance, get 2 orders out the bag, but I think that just feels so expensive, and you would have to take a comms officer as well in order to get that upgrade. So yeah, unfortunately, like Courage 1 and Speed 1 just really knackers your ability to play objectives, and they are very reliant on being in cover. Like, if they are caught out in the open, it does just mean they're probably going to get instantly blown away. And then also with white saves, do you really want to be moving into position to kind of like trade fire in the mid-range? I think, again, there are very few units you're actually going to be able to outshoot in that range. The heavy weapon upgrade is very decent and can offer some really nice sort of tech to get through armor. Like, you actually pull 2 crits on average with that weapon, which is pretty nice. But yeah, I think they are just a bit overcosted for what they are, and being speed 1 with no abilities that proc off movement is really rough. Personally, I would like to see them either have Sentinel baked in, which I think would be really nice, or a Courage 2 upgrade, just make their action economy that little bit better. And I think with either of those, they would be a lot more reasonable, but currently they are just a bit expensive for what they offer. One positive reason to bring the Rebel Veterans is it does give you access to the Mark II blaster, which I think is really solid. The fact that you don't sort of lose firepower as it gets wounded, it's basically either dead or alive, it's a bit more binary rather than just being chipped down, I think feels really good. And it sort of, same as with the Mortar, it offers very similar things. Its disadvantage is it's only range 3, and that does cause some issues because, again, if you're moving into range 3 to shoot something, that then means that range 2 units can move and shoot you back. And again, in that situation, you're probably going to get outshot most of the time. So the way it actually seems to be best to run these Mark IIs is just to kind of hoard up and defend a section of the board. So if you're running Echo-based defenders, for instance, you could have multiple Rebel Vets, multiple Mark II blasters, and then just set up a big like standby net to defend a section of the board. And that's not bad. But unfortunately, if you do try and trade damage, most of the time you are going to lose. Another thing to note about these notched base units is that they are not bad at just moving onto objectives because their bases are quite big. Even though they are speed 1 and they can't climb, it does mean that you are moving pretty far. Like, it's at least a speed 2 move, I would say, with that bigger base, even though they are only speed 1. They're, as I've said here, they're reasonably tough, and as long as you can get them in heavy cover, it'll probably be okay. Like, they might take a couple of hits to kill, but it is just that range 3 that does maybe knock them down a little bit. But they are fairly cheap, they are pretty efficient, and as long as you're sort of using them a bit more defensively to try and like hold a section of the board rather than pushing into people, it's not too bad at all. The next unit we're looking at is going to be the Clone Infantry, and these are obviously staple of almost every GAR list. They are 56 points, and the key bit for me is they offer the Reliable 1. Now, Reliable 1 in GAR is, I would say, like almost worth its weight in gold. Like the ability to have a surge on any of your clone units wherever you need them, be it, Cody, Arcs, Arfs, these themselves, Marksman, like sharing those surges around is such a huge deal. And I don't know how much you could value a surge in a Republic army at. I think it's not unreasonable to say it's worth 5 points. So if you have 5 lots of reliable going off, that makes this unit sort of 25 points cheaper, at least in my head, which takes a lot of the cost away. And I think that does make this unit a bit easier to take when you realise that basically all GAR units are slightly overcosted because they have access to token sharing. And I think this is another example. The weakness of this unit is that if you just want a sort of to get rid of your core tax, basically, if you just want to take 3 so you have other stuff in your army doing cool things, you have to spend a lot more points in order to do that. So compared to Rebels, where you can fulfill your core criteria for 120 points, if you're taking Clone Infantry, you already have to spend, 170 points, so an extra 50 points. And you're kind of expecting your units to do similar things. Obviously, clones can offer more in terms of being proactive and sharing those surges. Like, they are sort of naturally tougher. But it does mean that your sort of core tax is significantly higher, which is one of the reasons that maybe 501st has been good over the years, is because that core tax is a bit reduced. The other side you can take with your sort of infantry is because you have to take them, you can actually sort of, it's a bit like sunk cost, like suddenly you're like, oh, well, I've spent loads of points on this, maybe I should try and do a bit more with it. And that's why you see things like the super squad, so you can take 5s, the shotgun, the mega squad, and that comes to around 170 points. So it's why you're sort of maybe more likely to see those in GAR compared to other units, is if you've already spent all these points, well, then you may as well just try and make something with them. And actually, for a while, that was, I think, a really competitive way of running them, and you still see the super squad around quite a lot. I think the 6 at GAR list has definitely dropped in popularity a bit. I think it is a very tricky list to play, and I think it was a fun thing to experiment with. But for the majority of players, it's just too hard to use. So I think we still do see the super squad, at least I see the super squad around quite a lot, but not as common as it used to be. I think you could make the argument for Clone Infantry to come down to 54 or 53. And again, that may not sound like a huge deal, but it just makes it you can think of that reduction as being sort of multiplied by 3 because you're likely to take 3 of them. And so maybe coming down a couple of points might be a bit nice just to make these a little bit more easy to take. They do at least have competition in the slot now with the Clone Marksman, and I think there is probably a happy balance of the two. My gut instinct, I haven't taken GAR in a while now, but would be to take 1 unit of Marksman and 2 units of Infantry. I think that's probably how I would do it. So you get a little bit of cost saving with the Marksman, but then you also have the reliable one from the Infantry, because I think the Marksman look tempting until you realise that suddenly you don't have as much access to surges, and surges, I've said, are a huge deal in GAR, so losing access to those can feel pretty rough. Moving up to the next unit in B tier, it's going to be Riot. And how the mighty have risen, or something, I don't know what the opposite word for mighty is, but Riots used to be a complete laughingstock. I think they're now not terrible. Especially, I mean, not so much with the release of Callus, but with the points changes combined with the addition of Callus, if you really want to do that. It's 90 points for that sort of unit, and it hits for around 6 and gives you the ability to kind of immobilize a unit, and then suddenly you've got 7 red surging health in melee, which is a lot to deal with. There is definitely something there, and I think, again, it's this ability to have that sort of charge, that movement-based kind of benefit. Combined, you can take Imperial March with these, for instance, if you want to, which I think is pretty common. Yeah, I think there are just options with them. And again, I wouldn't take loads. I would probably only take 1, maybe 2, but I think in their niche, they are now significantly better than they were, and I would probably take them over regular Stormtroopers. And I think the key bit with Riots, in my head at least, is I'm not really running them for damage necessarily. The damage is definitely good, don't get me wrong, it's a nice thing to have, and actually the lack of Pierce probably isn't that big a deal, because if you're hunting maybe for a Force user, for instance, then the Pierce doesn't matter anyway. And, if you can force Anakin or Vader or Luke or something to roll, 6, 7 dice in melee, they won't be getting surges. They might take 3 or 4 wounds, and that's a big deal. And Riots can offer that, and I think that's really important. Combine that with the ability to lock those Force users down for a turn with his Callus's immobilize ability. There's maybe something there, and I think its weakness, obviously, is that it's very telegraphed. You know what it's going to be doing, and even with Imperial March, that does kind of limit its range. Obviously, it then becomes a little bit like Burst of Speed, effectively, and that 2 into a 3 is surprisingly far, but perhaps not as far as you need it to be. But they can offer, a little bit at range, and, and they're not completely defenseless at range, which is nice. But as I've put here, they need to avoid Pierce, essentially, because when you are running into melee, that is where there tends to be more Pierce, and this unit really hate Pierce because Red Surging Saves and Pierce just tend not to mesh too well together. So even though I think they are solid in their niche, personally I'd probably only be bringing 1, maybe 2 at a push to kind of fulfill your core criteria, while also offering something a bit more proactive than even Snows. I think like these can be more of an objective player than Snows, just because they are that bit faster, and while they aren't maybe as versatile in the options they have, they are a bit tougher when they get to objectives and get locked into melee. The next unit in B tier is going to be the Pike Foot Soldiers, and these are just a really solid core unit. I think if they were in Rebels and Empire, you might actually consider just taking them vanilla. The independent dodge one is great. Danger Sense 2 is good if you can get it fired up. Obviously, we love Outmaneuver. And the fact they have a pretty reasonable dice pool and some pretty nice heavy weapon upgrade. They're just fairly survivable and efficient. And I think, especially when you consider you can get the Disruptor, the Capo, and the base unit for around 80 points, that's pretty reasonable and offers some pretty decent firepower at range 3. I think generally the upgrade to take is probably the Disruptor gun, but the whip isn't terrible, and even at a push they can just be run naked. For instance, if you're in Shadow Collective, and again you just want to push your activation count up as high as you can, I don't think it's terrible to just run them naked and use them as objective players. I mean, in the previous version of the game, I've referred back to it a few times now, but previous version of the game, you used to just run these in your core slot because they were really reasonable, and I think they could offer some really good firepower. But again, the game's kind of just moved on from there, and where pikes are really good is against, I would say, repeated small amounts of damage, and those just aren't as common in the game anymore. Like that independent dodge 1 and danger sense 2 are effective against sort of smaller dice pools, but if you're being hit by sleeper cell or arcs, for instance, they really aren't going to do you much good. Like they aren't going to be the difference between you dying and surviving in a way that they might be against sort of smaller, more elite dice pools. As I said here, they're not generally taken out of Shadow Collective. They don't really offer anything compelling, and nothing that kind of the units in those armies don't already do. I think the only exception might be in Separatists, where maybe they could fulfill a tiny niche because they don't really have like a mid-range efficient shooting unit, but I just don't see a reason personally to take them. So I would kind of leave these at home most of the time outside of Shadow Collective. The final unit at the top of B tier is going to be the Stormtrooper Heavy Response unit, and this is only usable in Blizzard Force, but I thought I would put it in here. And effectively, the reason these are good is it just means you can take 2 efficient heavy weapons. So personally, I'd take the RT-97C and the DLT-19, which gives you 3 red and 3 right at range 4, with the Impact 1 if you want it. And effectively, that's just efficient, and it kind of means that you actually have some really decent range 4 firepower to offer, which is nice. They do need to be used carefully because, again, you just want to be engaging at range 4, but especially with the unhindered keyword and precise one, like you can just maneuver yourself into a pretty reasonable spot and then just take advantage of that range 4 firepower. Again, unfortunately, it is another thing that Empire doesn't need more of, is kind of these long-range shooting units, which is why I think Snows and Riots do probably see a bit more play than any variants of the Stormtrooper or Shores, is because Empire really kind of needs those efficient units to push up onto objectives. And unfortunately, I just don't think, as a result, they're as well suited to the current version of the game. They're not terrible, and I think, as with all things, as long as you have a unit that offers something that no other units in your army can do, eventually those units will become good just due to the nature of the way the game is going to change. But right now, they just don't suit the current version of the game. But being able to take 2 heavies on a base core unit is really good and offers you lots of efficient firepower for a fairly small cost. So if you are running Blizzard Force and you've got, a few spare points knocking around and you don't just want to take all snow troopers, then personally I think these are worth dropping in just for that extra firepower. Moving up to A tier, and I think as we start to get into the higher tiers, they're not hotter takes, but they are takes that are more based on my perception of what core units are generally trying to do. And I think very often in competitive lists, the job of a core unit is to let other units in the army shine. And I think those are definitely true in the current 2 strongest factions, which are Separatists and Rebels. Most of the time in the Rebel lists I'm running and the Rebel lists and Separatist lists I come against, the job of the core is just to fill activations and then score objectives when they need to. It's quite rare that the core units themselves are the reason the army is sort of shining and makes them very powerful. So a few of these takes are going to seem a bit strange because these units don't necessarily seem very powerful or game influencing, but that's kind of the point. As long as they're doing it efficiently and they're not kind of getting in the way of other units, like letting other units do their thing, that's when I think core units are really effective. There are some exceptions to that, and that's when I think the core units themselves become so powerful, a bit like with the Clone Mega Squad, where they can actually be part of the reason that your army shines. And I think those cases do exist, but in a lot of competitive lists, that is just a bit less common. So for instance, for Rebel troopers, the reason they are effective is they can sit behind a line of sight blocking, a wall or a building or something the entire game, not get in the way, not be detrimental to your list, and then suddenly in the last 2 turns of the game, they can just run out, score you an objective, and then run somewhere else and score you an objective later on, or clog up one of your opponent's main players. And the reason they are as effective as they are is because they got Agile 1 and because they have Nimble. And I genuinely think Agile 1 moves these from a C tier up to an A tier. Because having 2 dodges, and I don't know, you move into melee with something, right? I don't know, let's say Vader for the sake of argument. You sprint into Vader. If Vader doesn't have force push, he is then going to be forced to kill you. And actually, a base Rebel Trooper squad is really tricky for Vader to handle because he swings for 6. On average, he hits for kind of 4.5, 5. Let's buff him up and say he hits for 5. You dodge 2 of those, he's only doing 3 PS3, so he doesn't kill you on average. And that's huge, and that wouldn't be possible without those dodges. And then suddenly, the Rebel Troopers maybe rob an entire sort of activation or most of a turn from Vader, and you've paid 40 points for that. And that is just really good value, especially if they can score an objective. I mean, imagine Vader attacks and doesn't kill this unit. If he spent his entire turn to kill, 30 points of Rebels or something, you would take that every single day. And I think that's just one of the reasons why Rebel Troopers can be really strong. They do have their limitations. I'm not personally a believer in the heavy weapons. I know people do take the SX-21, the sort of shotgun, or the range 4 crit 1 gun can also be fairly decent. Iron gun also isn't bad. The problem is you then kind of make those troopers a target and you make it worthwhile to kill them. And I think one of the reasons that I really like Rebel Troopers is they are so cheap and so good at sort of putting that defensive tech together and making your opponent make awkward decisions. I think that's when they really shine. 40 points is great value and again really reduces that feeling of the core tax because the lists I run in Rebels tend to be quite hero hammer-y, and if you can just the Rebel Troopers being slightly cheaper allows you to get up to 12 acts rather than 11, for instance, with some big heroes, then that's a massive deal. Other reason I like Rebel Troopers is that you can get really cheap access to astromechs, so they are only 8 points, and especially when land speeders continue, in my opinion, to still be pretty good. If you heal 2 wounds on a land speeder with these, on top of doing all the other stuff, for only 48 points, I think that's such a good deal, and yeah, I just really enjoy a Rebel Trooper, and I don't think they're ever a bad inclusion as a core option in a list. There are, I think, more powerful options, but I think a Rebel Trooper is always solid and fulfills what a core option in Rebels is trying to do most of the time. B2s. I am a fan of B2s up to a point. I think the sort of mega B2 thing that was run a lot at the start of the game was a little bit bait. And I think what you very often found was the B2s were getting quite isolated because they aren't super quick. They don't have, steady or charge or anything like that. So they don't have any abilities that proc off movement. And generally, if they got to a point, they would kind of have to then stay there. And there was definitely a game I played, I think it was on maybe Intercept Signals, where my opponent chucked a squad of Mega B2s and I think it was Aquas on one side of the board. And I was like, okay, that point's lost. I'm just going to go to the other side. And they didn't quite have the speed or the range to then be able to influence the game. And I think that is just a little bit of a problem for B2s, is they can sometimes feel a little bit isolated. Saying that, they do offer great survivability. They are in a faction that has good abilities to support them with aims. They can also get transports off snails, which is a really nice option to have, like jumping this unit forward basically like range 1.5 or something with the transport from the snail. Just feels really good. You do have to be careful as to where you drop them, but moving this unit further forward does feel really good, especially if you're taking the T series and like the ACM, for instance. Like, that firepower is really scary. This unit does love a surge, same as basically I see these as better version of the Black Sun Enforcers, because they're tougher, they can't be suppressed, and they have more kind of inherent faction synergy, being a droid trooper rather than just a normal trooper. And so I think those are just really nice options to have. I think there's not a lot else to say about B2s, really. They're just very solid and they are hard to kill. I think they're actually the main reason that repair ended up going up as much as it did in Separatists, because just bringing these back for cheap was really effective. But yeah, I don't think, spoiler, they're not the strongest version of core in Separatists, but they can offer something really strong, and they don't have to be kind of the main star, but they can be a really good sort of supporting part of that, where their damage is pretty scary, they're hard to deal with, and yeah, they're just an efficient use of points in most armies. Next unit is going to be Snowtroopers, and I'm really partial to a Snowtrooper in the Empire lists I've run. I think steady is a phenomenal keyword, and when you couple it with the ion gun, the ability to just harass at range 3, especially if you can harass vehicles, I think is really strong. 66 points, as I've said here, with the ion gun is great, and if you can rob actions from droids or vehicles, feels amazing. Yeah, they're just a really nice unit to have. Imperial March, I think, is a good take on them as well. Like, that speed 1 into speed 2 means sometimes you get to shoot on turn 1, which is great, but does mean you can just use steady shenanigans on turn 2, turn 3 as you push up the board. You can also take flamers. I'm not a huge flamer believer. I think, again, it just limits your kind of options in the early game, and I would much rather get 2 shots off with an ion gun than 1 shot off with a flamer, personally. But flamers are a good threat to have, and I think if you're taking like triple snows, then maybe 2 ions and 1 flamer is probably the way to go. Again, we are probably going to see Mega Squads being more prevalent. The Mega Squad on, I think, these and Stormtroopers got cheaper, and Mega Squad on fleets got cheaper as well, so I think we will start to see more of those knocking around. I do think they are the best Empire core by a distance, and they're definitely the only ones in A tier for me. They're just really solid, and they suit this version of the game a lot more than the rest of the core. I think the only other basic core that kind of gets close is Riots, but Riots are a lot more limited in their options, whereas Snows give you a good variety of options. You can even do split fire if you want to. Like, you can fire the iron gun at a vehicle and the rest of them at some regular troopers if you want to suppress them. Courage 1 is a shame, and especially with Imperial March, you do want to be going twice, but you can jump out, shoot, move back, and then that limits the amount of firstly you can be shot, but also the suppression you're going to pick up. So they do have really good options. They are nice and versatile, and they're never going to hit like insanely hard, but they're going to hit hard enough for your opponent to have to pay attention to them, and that's really important. Fleets. Before the Cassian change, Pro Cassian was brought in and the Mega Squad was buffed, I think these would have been low B tier. Yeah, probably low to mid B tier. Now, I think they are actually one of the better core units in the game. I think the Lando Cassian Mega Fleet shotgun thing is actually going to become a real kind of not meta staple, but it's going to be something we see quite a lot of. I've played a couple of games with it now, and they're weirdly tough, and they feel quite like relentless. Because Cassian, basically after you've taken a wound, you can flip Cassian's card, so he gets 2 red, which is really nice in range 2 and melee, but also he gives them infinite courage, and they get extra white dice for each member of the squad that's defeated. With the Mega Squad, suddenly, like, even if you've only got Cassian and the shotgun left, you're still throwing like 4 red and I think like 8 white or something, which still hits for like 7 or 8 PS1, which is crazy. Yeah, they're just really decent, and the full squad hits for 10 PS1, which is again amazing. Like, at that stage, you can actually consider targeting vehicles, because you're suddenly throwing, either against Armor 5, you're probably throwing like 5 or 6 PS1 over the top, which is just wild. Couple that with the Lando guidance thing that I tried a bit before and didn't quite work for me because I didn't quite understand how to use it. But essentially, if you can get fleets into melee and Lando can give them a guidance, you could attack twice with fleets in one turn, because it's actually a real pain to get rid of standbys in melee unless, you're a dark side with access to demoralize or something. And yeah, fleets are just I think they're gonna be a real menace. They're not invincible. They can be shredded if you're not careful. And I do think, as I've said before, flamers will start to become more of a thing. Not to specifically counter these, but I think there are just quite a broad variety of things that flamers are solid against. And then in the situations where they're good, they're amazing. So they probably are just worth bringing along. The caveat to all of this is I think you do only need 1 unit. I think you can bring 2. I think a main Cassian squad and then a backup squad with the shotgun, just in case that unit gets shredded, might be the way to go. But I think that 1 squad by itself justifies being A tier. Like, it feels really powerful, very efficient, hits hard, and it's very hard to stop. And especially, as I've said, with the guidance thing from Lando, you can just chuck them a lot further forward than people expect. Like, 3 speed 2 moves in a turn is a lot to deal with if Lando gives them the first speed 2 and then he can go the moves themselves. And the brilliant thing is, because they're a mega squad, you can pull off the standard coherent shenanigans. So actually, you're probably not able to shoot that many, and they're always getting heavy cover and all this stuff. Like, they feel really good, and they mitigate a lot of the problems that Rebel Core often run into. So I'm really excited to see where these go. I think in the right hands, these could be an absolute terror. And even in my hands, I found this to be pretty powerful. So yeah, looking forward to seeing more of these. The final unit at the top of A tier is going to be Geos. And these don't feel like a core unit to me, and I mean that in the best way possible. They do things that it feels like a Special Forces unit should do. Their objective play is wild. I am such a fan of Geos. Like, you don't need loads, probably only 1 or 2, maybe sprinkled in with a bunch of B1s. But if you just have 1 on each flank, they are the best unit if you are able to punch down. If you can jump up, shoot, jump down, or jump up, shoot, do a load of damage to the unit, and then jump onto an objective, being able to move 3 times a turn is just such a big deal, especially when it's only 45 points and they fulfill your core criteria. They're not a mercenary, they fulfill your core criteria. That just feels so strong. And as I've said before, pair these with like Sunfac, for instance, on a flank, and I think they just feel so strong. You can take the heavy weapon, you can take a mega squad if you want to, like, there are options. Personally, I would just run a base squad with a heavy weapon, and then you can just jump up and punish units very, very easily. Death and Rub's great, removing cover, like, on this size of dice pool as well, feels really good. What can I say? Like, I think I've spoken quite a lot about these units before. I am a big fan. Don't just throw them up the middle. Don't treat them like a regular core unit. You need to use them carefully and really take advantage of line of sight blocking. But if you can take advantage of line of sight blocking and you are sort of counter-attacking rather than jumping up first, they just feel so good. And the level of flexibility, the objective play, I think is just such a good combination. So yeah, I'm a really big fan. And they're only 45 points, so they're not even that much of an investment. Yeah, I think they are just, in this particular version of the game, with the way objectives are, and the ability to just move really quickly across the board continues to be really valuable. I'm a big fan of Geos. And the final unit, and the only one in S tier, is going to be B1s. Coordinate Droid Trooper is just absurd. It it almost defines the faction, I would say, in some ways, but it definitely defines this unit. What Coordinate Droid Trooper does is it makes your turn 1 the most consistent turn 1 of any faction. And as I continue to say, I think maybe half of the game-ish is decided on turn 1. If you can guarantee having really good order control and really high activation count on turn 1, you put yourself in such a strong position to do well later into the game. And that's what B1s enable you to do. You can take heavy weapons on them, you can take support stuff, all of those are valid if you want to do that. Like, I think the range 4 sniper weapon that gives them crit 1 is a really decent take some of the time. But if you're just taking them base, and if all they do all game is just chain orders along and give you more consistency in your stack and let your big hitters, Dooku, AAT, Grievous on Wheelbike, I don't know, fucking Aquas, like, if you let those units shine, then they've done their job. They don't have to be doing what fleets do. They don't have to be doing what B2s do. They just have to enable your army to play really effectively. And Separatists, I think, a huge part of their win rate is carried by how good their turn 1 is. And their turn 1 is as good as it is, partly, if not mostly, because of B1s. And for me, that's why they're S tier. You can talk about their abilities and what all the other stuff does if you want to. I wouldn't even bother. I would just focus on the fact you can take 6 of these for 230 points, and they're a pain to kill because there's 6 of them, and you know that's past the point where it's easy for a Force user to deal with. For instance, most Force users aren't able to consistently do the 6 PS2 that you probably need to kill these guys, so then they just become frustrating to deal with. But as I say, for the early game alone, for that order consistency, I think they are phenomenal. But yeah, there we go. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are there any? I don't think there are any I missed, but let me know if there are any I missed. And what do you think? Are there any that should be higher, should be lower? I'd be really interested to hear what people think. And yeah, we're getting towards the end now. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to sort of draw this tier list series together. Maybe I'll go through and talk about all the tier lists in one video. I think that would be quite interesting. But yeah, thank you again so much for watching. Like, subscribe, etc. And I will see you for the next one.